Hey everyone, this is Summer with Summerly Design Co. and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to knit colorwork on socks. This video is a tutorial that goes along with my new colorwork sock set. I've got 3 patterns here that come with the set. I will post a link to these patterns in the description below this video so you can check them out on Ravelry or Etsy, and these are kind of the tips and tricks I'm going to be talking about today, how to achieve color work like this on a pair of socks. There are some differences when you knit color work on socks as opposed to like a sweater or a hat. A sock has negative ease, meaning it fits very snugly against your foot and your leg, but it still needs to have a lot of stretch so you can get it over the heel of your foot. When I first tried to knit colorwork socks, my floats looked beautiful, but they were just a little bit too tight and I could not get it over my heel. So there's a couple of things that we're going to go over in the video today. We're going to talk about needle size. We're going to talk about what kind of sock knitting you should do, whether it's magic loop, double pointed needles, tiny circulars, and we're going to talk about just how to manage your yarn, how to manage your floats if you are new to colorwork knitting, especially new to colorwork knitting on socks. This video will cover all the basics so that you can start knitting colorwork socks as well. If you find this video helpful, always helpful to give me a thumbs up on there. And once again, I will put all the links to my Instagram, my Ravelry, my Etsy, and this pattern set in particular in the description of the video. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to move these guys out of the way. And first, let's talk about what needles you should use. You can knit color work using double pointed needles, magic loop, or tiny circulars. It's completely up to you. I prefer tiny circulars for color work. So that's typically what I use when I'm knitting color work. In this video, I'm going to start out with tiny circulars, but I will put my stitches onto magic loop so that you can kind of see how that goes as well. But for now, let's start with the tiny circulars. Ordinarily, I do not like knitting with tiny circulars because they hurt my hands. But for color work, it is the absolute easiest way, in my opinion, to manage your yarn and to get really neat work. And that's kind of important just so that it's fun. Not super fun to knit color work if your yarn keeps getting tangled and if it's just really fussy and fiddly. These particular tiny circular needles I found are by Addi, and they're called Addi Easy Socks. And I like them because one needle is longer than the other, and that actually makes it a little bit easier on your hands. My hands do not cramp when I use these tiny circulars. So I kind of found ones that worked for me, and now when I knit color work, it just flies. Like, it goes so fast because it's not fiddly and my hands don't cramp. So that's why I really like them a lot. So regardless of what method you're using to knit socks, whether it's tiny circulars, magic loop, double pointed needles, yarn management is the first thing we need to talk about when it comes to knitting color work on socks. You always keep your main color to the right of you, and then you always keep your contrast color that you're using to make the design to the left. And as you can see, the strands are separate. And if you just keep your yarn like that, you shouldn't get tangles, and you can just knit away without having to stop and untangle yarn that just gets twisted and twisted and twisted. If you were to keep both balls on one side, then you would definitely get twist and tangles. So just keep your contrast color on your left and your dominant color, your main color here on the right, and you'll be good to go. So that's the first thing that you need to know when knitting color work on socks. The second thing that we need to keep our eye on is our tension. When you see color work socks or color work anything that looks puckered, it's because the tension was too tight. The floats were too tight. And when I talk about floats, I'm talking about this. These are our floats, these little strands of yarn that hang out on the wrong side of your work, where you're carrying color along and only knitting with it every so often. You get floats. And if these floats are too tight, you will get puckering. Not only that, your sock will not be able to fit over your heel. So it's really important to keep our tension relatively loose. We don't want to be so loose that these floats are just like hanging there and can snag our toe, but we want them loose enough that we still have a lot of stretch in our sock to get it over our heel, and so that we don't get puckering. And as you can see, this sock still has a lot of stretch. If my floats were too tight, I would not be able to pull on it that much and get that much stretch. So it's really important that we keep our floats kind of loose. I can kind of pick this up, as you can see, and that just has a lot of nice give. So how do we do that? Very good question. To keep your floats just nice and loose, you just want to knit with a little bit looser tension when you knit your contrasting stitches. You can see in this little sample here, I'm knitting a lice stitch, and this is what a lice stitch looks like. This is called the lice stitch. It's a really disgusting name for a really cute stitch pattern, but that's what I'm knitting here on this sample. And one of the most important things to remember is just to keep your tension a little bit looser than you normally would whenever you knit your colorwork stitches, and that keeps your floats nice and loose. You can see on the back here, still got a lot of stretch. These aren't pulled too tight. I can pick them up with a finger and kind of pull them out. Another thing that you want to do is when you're knitting, you don't want to let your stitches get all bunched up like this. You want to keep spreading your stitches out. So stop every so often and spread those stitches out so that your floats are spread out as well. If your work is all bunched up like this when you're making those little floats on the back, then that's going to cause tight floats. So we want to stop every so often and spread out our stitches. Now there's several different ways that you can knit colorwork. Some people like to hold the contrast yarn in one hand and your working yarn in the other, and then you would just keep it that way the whole time you're knitting. And when you come to a stitch, you would pick it like you would if you were knitting continental. This is very hard to do on camera. So that's how they would do it. And then they would just keep going and just hold both yarns at once, working yarn in the right hand, contrast color in the left hand, and picking. Again, I'm standing up hunched over, so I'm not going super fast in case you think I'm a bad knitter. So that's one way to do it. And I do it that way if I'm knitting colorwork on magic loop or double pointed needles. However, on tiny circulars, it just doesn't work for my hands. That's actually harder for me to do on tiny circulars. It's much easier for me just to knit like I normally would. And of course I knit English style, as you can see. So I would just knit, drop that. I don't have my yarn pulled out. Knit, drop, pick up. And I know that seems kind of like fussy, but it's really not. Like once you get going, I get going super fast, and it's like not even a thing at all to just drop it and pick it up when I need it and keep going. And again, keep those stitches kind of spread out so your floats stay nice and loose, and make sure that when you're knitting your contrast color, you just keep your tension a little bit looser than normal. You don't want tight floats that are really pulling at your stitches. You want them nice and loose. So again, keep those stitches spread out on your right needle, knit with just a little bit less tension than you normally would. The third component to making sure that your colorwork socks can fit over your foot, in addition to keeping your tension a little looser on your contrast stitches and keeping your stitches spread out, is to knit with a slightly bigger needle. Normally, I knit my socks with a US size 1 needle. When I do colorwork, I use a size 2 needle, and that's just an extra help to make sure that my socks fit. Typically, I will cast on and knit my cuff with my size 1s, and then I'll switch to size 2s to do the colorwork portion. If I'm mixing it up and I just have colorwork on some parts of the sock, like this one I cast on my cuff in a size 1, I switched and did my colorwork on the tiny circular size 2, and then when I was ready for the foot portion, which is just straight knitting, just stripes, I switched back to magic loop and knit the rest on size 1 needles. But this is the part that counted. This is the part that I needed to get over my heel. So it's just knit on a slightly larger needle. Can't really tell. It pretty much looks like it was all knit on the same needle. So that's another helpful tip. And these sock patterns right here, All of the Colorwork portions are knit on a size 2 needle. So again, that just helps give you a great fit. All 3 of these socks fit really, really well because I kept my tension a little bit looser on my color stitches, kept my stitches spread out, and I knit them on a slightly bigger needle. So that's kind of the key to Colorwork socks. So I am going to transfer these stitches onto Magic Loop, because if you knit Colorwork on Magic Loop, there's an extra few things you need to know. So I will be back in a moment. All right, I've now transferred all of my stitches from the tiny circulars onto a much longer circular needle to do Magic Loop so that I can show you the differences in yarn management and how you catch your floats when you're working Magic Loop. So the difference is when you're working Magic Loop from a tiny circular is that you have needle ends to deal with. When you're knitting a tiny circular needle, it's just like knitting anything in the round, like a hat. You don't really have needle ends. You're just going around in a circle. However, when you do Magic Loop, eventually you do come to the end of a needle, and then you have to start knitting on another needle. And that's where it's really important that we manage our contrasting color yarn, this yarn, really well so that we don't get strands of yarn that cut diagonally across the inside of our work. So that means that we're going to need to catch floats at the end, the very last stitch on the end of a needle before switching to the next needle. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. All the other tips that I showed you when working on a tiny circular are going to apply to Magic Loop and double pointed needles as well. You're still going to want to keep your main yarn on the right, your contrast color yarn on the left, so that you don't get twists and tangles in your yarn as you work. You are still going to want to keep your tension a little bit looser when you knit those contrasting stitches to keep your floats nice and a little bit loose, not too tight, so you don't have puckering and so your sock fits. And you're still going to want to keep your stitches spread out, nice and spread out here on the needle. You do not want them bunched up like that. So just as you're knitting, keep spreading those out. Oh, great. My needle just fell out of my stitches. Eee. Okay. It's back on. It's fine. Okay. So anyways, all those tips still apply. You're just going to be doing one thing different whenever you're working on Magic Loop. So basically, right now, and of course I knit this like out of the stitch pattern just for illustration purposes so I could show you. Let's say that your last contrast color is, in my case, I've got 3 stitches before the end that I'm going to be knitting in the blue, and I'm not going to be doing another stitch in this color on this needle. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to knit to the last stitch, and what you want to do is you just want to catch the float. You want to catch it on this last stitch. So your contrasting color, you want to catch the float, and you're just going to flip it over the needle like that. And then you're just going to knit the stitch as usual, okay? That contrasting color, that turquoise, is not showing through on the right side. But if I turn it over, as you can see on the back side, I caught that float. And that means that this contrasting color yarn is now at the end, and that's where we want it to be. Otherwise, when we go to pick it up on this side, it would cut diagonally across our work like that. We want it to catch the float so that it just goes around the sock. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and flip this over. All right, now I'm ready to knit with my contrasting yarn again. And then we'll just keep going a few so I can kind of show you. Okay. So if you look at the inside, my float curves around along the side. It does not stretch diagonally. It's just a nice loose little float there that curves along with the edge of the sock. So when you're doing color work, very important, catch your floats at the end of a needle. And if I were not going to be knitting with my contrasting color pretty much right away on the new needle, I would go ahead and catch it again at the beginning of the needle. And I'm going to show you how to catch floats one more time. This applies whether you're knitting at the end of a needle or in the middle. Catching floats is the same. I'll knit a few stitches here. All right, so you just hold your contrasting color yarn in your left hand. You just pop it over the needle like that, and then you knit. And you have caught a float, and it does not show up on the right side. It is just hanging out there on the back side, caught behind those stitches so that it can carry along with you. In this particular sock pattern, this is the third pattern in the set, and as you can see, I never ever have you knitting where you've got long breaks in between colors. For the most part, you have maximum maybe 5 stitches. And that way you don't ever have to catch floats as you're knitting your sock, because there's never a bigger space. When you're knitting socks, if you go more than 5 stitches in one color, you want to catch your float. Because any longer than that, and it just reduces the stretchiness of your sock. There's one row right here in the middle of the flower, the little dot. There are a lot of stitches in between those dots. So you will need to catch floats about every 5th stitch in between those dots so that you don't have a really long float that stretches out. And that is literally the only row in the entire pattern set where you have to catch floats. And it's just that one row. So just whenever you're knitting this particular pattern and you come to that row, and I think there's like 11 stitches in between these 2 contrasting color stitches, you'll want to catch your float in between there so you don't have a super long float. And it's kind of hard to see it on this one because there's just so many strands here, but it's right in the middle here. I just caught floats just on that one row. All the other rows, there's very rarely, I mean, there's a couple of rows where I think you've got 5 stitches in between, and that's it. So you don't have to catch floats and worry about it there. So anyways, that is pretty much the tips for knitting color work on socks. Once again, this particular pattern set is available on Ravelry and Etsy. You can check out my Instagram if you want to see more pictures of these lovely little socks. And I will post links to the pattern as well as my Instagram in the description of this video. If you have any questions, you can also email me. You can find that info on my Instagram as well. And yeah, I hope you have a lot of fun knitting color work. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much.